everyone, welcome to another Modern Deck Tech. Today, Temur turns. So, this is a revisit. I first deck teched this deck last September, and I had a lot of fun with it at the time. I called it Temur Warp Midrange at the time, but I'm just calling it Temur Turns, because that's really what it is. I really had a lot of fun revisiting this deck and updating it with new tech, some ideas taken from other turns decks, some ideas that I've just maintained from my original, because it's just a great deck overall. I wanted to make the deck fun to play, and I didn't want it to be necessarily always having extremely repetitive patterns. But then again, it is a turns deck, so inevitably there are going to be some repetitive patterns. But let's just get into it. Let's see, I'll mention some of the changes as we go along here. Let's get right into the core, but before we do, just a quick reminder, I do have a Patreon. If you haven't checked it out, there's a link in the description. The Patreon account is slowly growing, and I really appreciate the support. Patreon is really there actually to give back to the channel and to give back to patrons. So check out the tiers, check out the patron rewards, basically rewards that you get back at the end of the year. The way it's basically structured is as you become a patron for a longer period of time, you get back most of the money that you put in the form of rares and mythics. So yeah, as the patron count goes up, you actually get a lot more money back, and if you're a patron for more than 18 months, I believe, you start making potentially more than what you're putting in, because everything that goes into Patreon actually goes straight to boxes that I buy, sealed product I open up on this channel, and then all those rares and mythics are going right back to the patrons. So check that out. I would really appreciate your support. Even if it's $5 a month, that's already more than enough. Yeah, thanks. So the core. Alright, so 3 cards that have definitely stayed here, and they're strictly 4-ofs. Time Warp, of course, is a 4-of. It's a 2 blue 3. Target player takes an extra turn after this one. Always make sure you target yourself, just an FYI. And if you're playing in paper, if you're playing some opponent who says target, just make sure you say yourself. But yeah, Time Warp. Very cool. You can abuse that. I mean, that's one of the main goals of this deck, is to abuse Time Warp and keep casting it over and over and over again. Tamiyo, Collector of Tales, helps you do that first. Its +1 ability allows you to search for Time Warp in the first place and get it into your hand early. Or it allows you to take Time Warp that you've already cast from your graveyard and put it back into your hand so that you could keep casting it again and again and again. And it's a fine balance between keeping Tamiyo up on loyalty points so she doesn't, kill herself essentially whenever she does a -3. But there are ways to make that happen, and you'll see that in the matches that I post up later today. Stay tuned for those. I always post 3 after a deck tech as usual. So Tamiyo, definitely a centerpiece of this deck. Most other turn decks only really play 2 of her, maybe 3, but she's a 4 big time. She's really, really great. Definitely a must answer. And what's really great about her is that the -3 doesn't always have to go to Time Warp. That is your goal, but sometimes it's perfectly legitimate to -3 a Veil of Summer, or to -3 a Tarmogoyf, or whatever it may be. Sometimes you just need another card in the graveyard that you need to be able to recast again, and that's a perfectly fine target sometimes to make sure you stay alive long enough to get your turn lock. So yeah, Tamiyo is just a really great Planeswalker overall for a deck like this. Renin 6 also, definitely a 4-of. Helps you make sure you hit your land drops, obviously, every turn with the +1 ability. The -1 ability is okay if you really need to take out like a problematic creature. That's fine, but really you want to do the +1 as much as possible so that you can get to its -7. Because once you -7, yeah, that's almost the key component, it's one of the ways, let's say, that you could get a soft lock on your opponent, or even a hard lock in terms of turns, because you just have to make sure you maintain a certain level of lands in your hand. And honestly, having 3-4 consecutive turns in a row, and subsequently having 3 to 4 combat phases essentially in a row, is usually game over for your opponent. Even if you only have 1 Tarmogoyf or something on the battlefield, you're going in for 4 or 5 damage each turn. It's just eventually game over, and that's usually how you win with this deck, is just taking 3 to 4 extra turns, and it's GG. Sometimes you need to go a bit extra, and that's fine. You need to go 5, 6, 7, 8 turns extra, just looking for your threats, your finishers, and that's okay. This deck does it pretty well once you get into the soft lock. Now, if you have the luxury, obviously, get Renin 6 to 8 loyalty first before you -7 it. That way you can guarantee that you'll always have lands that you can get back from the graveyard and put it into your hand. but sometimes it's perfectly legitimate to -7 it, kill it, and get your emblem. And you might have another Renin 6 in your hand, so you could just recast Renin 6 after that. Boom, done. Fires of Invention is a new addition to this deck. I was unsure about Fires of Invention before, but having played with it now a lot, man, this card, I mean, what is this card? I don't know how they could have printed this card. So let's read it real quick, because it's not a card you see often. You can cast spells only during your turn, and you can cast no more than 2 spells each turn. Alright, so first of all, yes, when Fires of Invention is cast and resolves, it counts as 1 spell that turn, so you can only cast 1 more spell that turn. Just keep that in mind. It doesn't start counting after it starts counting from the beginning of your turn. So, something to keep in mind. Second of all, you can't play Permission in the main with Fires of Invention, obviously, because it prevents you from playing Permission outside of your turn, which effectively makes your Permission useless. So, keep that in mind. You can't play an interactive deck, at least not really, with Fires of Invention on the battlefield. But who cares? Because once Fire of Invention is on the battlefield, you can start casting spells for free. And that's really, really powerful, because most of the time it means you're casting 2 spells a turn instead of 1, and that's okay. That's already putting you at a great advantage in a deck like this, where you really want to get your opponent to an infinite turn lock as soon as possible. So Fire of Inventions comes down turn 4, sometimes turn 3, and if you have 4 to 5 lands already on the battlefield, boom, you can cast Tamio, Collector of Tales, or Renin 6, or maybe you already have 5 lands on the battlefield, so you can cast Time Warp immediately and go on to your next turn. This is how Fire's Invention is really, really powerful. So as long as you have 5 lands on the battlefield, which you can get to relatively easily with Renin 6 and Explore, which we'll get to in a second, you can start casting your spells for free, which is really, really powerful, really, really great. It essentially is cast 1 extra spell every turn. That's essentially what you're doing. So if you have 5 mana, you're actually playing at around 9 mana with Fires of Invention on the battlefield, because you cast 2 spells a turn. So Fires of Invention, a huge upgrade to this deck. It also allows me to play another turns card, which we'll get to in a second. But before we do, let's cover the creatures here, or the other creatures. So we still have Arbor Elf here, although I have dropped Utopia Sprawl. In the original deck, well, in the deck that I deck tech last year, I had Utopia Sprawl. Not really, I mean, I have no space for it. To include Fires of Invention and to include Savor the Moment, which we're going to get to in a second, I didn't have space for Utopia Sprawl anymore. So I'm keeping Arbor Elf in, just as a ramp. I mean, at this point, that means you could replace Arbor Elf with anything you want. It could be Noble Hierarch or Birds of Paradise. I just kept Arbor Elf. Doesn't really matter. Doesn't make much of a difference here. But yeah, I kept Arbor Elf, but no Utopia Sprawl. Icefang Coatl is still here. You still want to be able to draw cards, extra cards as much as possible. And, it could be used as pseudo removal. And sometimes you just attack in with Icefang Coatl and subsequently win the games sometimes. So Icefang Coatl, definitely a 4 of. Not super important to get a lot of snow basics onto the battlefield. I mean, snow permanents onto the battlefield. It's a nice touch to give it death touch, but it's not really necessary. It's mostly there to be a blocker or an attacker and being able to cantrip at the same time. Tarmogoyf is your main removal, is your main threat here in this deck. It's the main creature that you're going to be killing your opponents with. So ideally, your opponents don't surgically extract it, because if they do, it's going to be a very long kill with your Arbor Elves and Icefang Coatls. But yeah, that's just the way this deck is. There are some weak points to it. This would be one of them. Your threat suite is relatively light. Now, you could replace Icefang Coatl with another creature, another threat that's beefy enough. You could do that, but I didn't really try. I found that this suite worked perfectly fine most of the time. So yeah, and plus, I mean, Surgical Extraction has better targets than Tarmogoyf, like Time Warp or Tamio. So yeah, I'm not too concerned there. So the other extra turn card in this deck that I didn't have in the first iteration was Savor the Moment. So it's much cheaper than Time Warp, 2 less. Take an extra turn after this one, skip the untap step of that turn. So this is the downside of getting the extra turn, is that if you cast this for 3 mana, actually paying it like a chump, and not getting it for free off of Fires of Invention, you're going to be down 3 mana next turn. Sometimes that's perfectly fine, especially early on. Getting an extra turn just to get an extra draw step and ideally draw into the Tamio that you need, or into the Renin 6, or into the Time Warp, whatever it may be. Savor the Moment might be perfectly fine. Obviously, if you have Fires of Invention, that's perfectly great as well. So imagine you cast Fire as an Invention and then cast Savor the Moment. So your mana is tapped out, but next turn you have already 4 mana on the battlefield, or potentially 5. Doesn't really matter if they're tapped or not, because now you have Fires of Invention. So, whether they're tapped doesn't matter. You could just cast your spells anyway. So Savor the Moment, definitely a big upgrade here. A card you could potentially sideboard out if you need space. Post game 1. That's another tricky part about this deck, is that because most of the pieces are super important, it's also very hard to sideboard in this deck. Savor the Moment is one of those cards where you could sacrifice a few, in place of sideboard cards. Keep in mind, this deck worked pretty well, last year when I deck teched it, and I didn't use Savor the Moment at all. I just relied on Time Warp. So this is, something flexible when you're sideboarding. The removal, you're playing Lightning Bolt, 4 of. Keep in mind, you can't cast this on your opponent's turn once Fire of Invention is on the battlefield, but I still think Lightning Bolt is important. Sometimes you just need it to get that last 3 damage in to end the game quickly. So Lightning Bolt's definitely important, even if you're only casting it on your turn. You have a Ram spell, Explore. You could have, in theory, played any other 2-mana Ram spell here, but Explore, I think, is fine. You may play an additional land this turn and draw a card. Cool. Most of the time, you will be getting that extra land drop, ideally, and drawing a card is beautiful, so 4 of Explore. Now they're getting to the lands. Nothing too crazy here, honestly, in terms of lands. 2 Breeding Pools, 1 Steam Vents, 1 Stomping Ground. Kind of standard in a Temur deck that you would see in a deck like this. 4 Misty Rainforest, 4 Prismatic Vistas, and 1 Wooded Foothills. I didn't play Scalding Tarns. I feel Prismatic Vistas make a bit more sense here. You have plenty of targets in your deck in terms of basics, so you're never really going to be short. And I just like the flexibility of being able to get anything, in particular Forest, because Forest is kind of important in this deck. So Scalding Tarn just made less sense here. Prismatic Vista made more sense. It's really up to you. If you don't have any Prismatic Vistas, you only have Scalding Tarns, play those. You probably won't see much of a difference. 1 Wooded Foothills, and you have 1 Snow-Covered Mountain, 4 islands, Snow-Covered Islands, and 2 Snow-Covered Forests. Sideboard. 3 Veil of Summer. Mostly coming in when you're playing against control decks, which are really not a good matchup. We'll get to that in a second. Cleansing Wildfire to deal with Tron, or Primeval Titan, or any other deck that heavily relies on lands, or specific lands. Cleansing Wildfire will help you out with there. You could technically play Blood Moon, but the problem with Blood Moon is that, well, you need double blue often here, so that's really going to be brutal. You're going to be cutting yourself off of 1 land, or waiting too long to play Blood Moon, at which point it would become useless. So I'm playing Cleansing Wildfire instead. You could play Alpine Moon instead of Cleansing Wildfire. That's perfectly legitimate. I just wanted a card that cantripped as well, which is why I chose Cleansing Wildfire. But Alpine Moon might actually be a better choice, but I stuck to this when I was playing with this deck. Anger of the Gods to deal with aggro decks, even Dredge potentially. Aggro decks can be a bit quicker than you, and you may need Anger of the Gods to help stabilize early on, get rid of those cards forever because they get exiled, and then you have a bit more time to get into your lock. Getting this out turn 3 and turn 4 might be very devastating because your opponent might already be out of gas. So using this plus Lightning Bolt should be enough to keep your opponents at bay. If it isn't, Reality Shift can also come in to help you out here, to help you exile extra creatures. That's a combo you might want to use when you're playing against super aggro decks. Reality Shift could also come in against certain types of combo decks, even Stoneblade decks if you want to get rid of, anything basically in the Stoneblade deck is going to be a problem for you. Of course, Return to Nature is also good for Stoneblade decks, getting rid of artifacts in general. Targeting cards in a graveyard, it's very flexible, which is why I'm using Return to Nature. In my sideboard here, you could swap this out for whatever you want. Just remember, when you're attacking the graveyard, you want to make sure you could still cast cards from your own graveyard, so Grafdigger's Cage is out of the question in this case. This is the sideboard suite that I chose. You could choose differently depending on your meta and play style. The matchups. Combo. Spell-based combo, you're kind of screwed. Not the best. You basically have to make sure you have the perfect play. If you can ramp into Fires of Invention on turn 3, you could potentially have enough to lock your opponent early on in extra turns. Really going to be hard. If you're playing against Storm, ideally you can bolt some of their accelerant creatures early on really slow them down, have them stumble a bit, and then you're good. If you expect to be playing against a lot of spell-based combo, is really going to be a call. You could play a different iteration of this deck without Fires of Invention and Savor the Moment, and in their plays play, Force of Negation, Remand, or Counterspell. This is totally possible, and I played something closer to that in the original version, or have a transformative sideboard instead. So play the main 60 that you see in this deck tech, but in your sideboard, instead of the sideboard that you saw here, play, put 4 Force Negations or counter spells or whatever. Put a permission package in there, or specific hate cards for combo decks, spell-based combo decks in there, and just be transformative. Accept that in games 2 and game 3, you'll be a bit slower because you're also now dealing with slowing down your opponent, as opposed to just kind of rushing through whatever you want to do. So that's what that would be my assessment of combo decks. At least spell-based combo, not your best matchup out the gate. Now primetime decks, again, similar. They can be slightly slower than spell-based combo decks, so that might be to your benefit, because if you could get them into a lock by turn 4 or even turn 5, if they haven't, if things haven't aligned for them, or if you've bolted some of their early accelerants, then you should be okay. And then you have plenty of cards in the sideboard to slow them down even further in games 2 and games 3. So I think against creature-based combo decks, you're a bit better off overall compared to spell-based. That's just my assessment of combo. Aggro decks, like I mentioned in the sideboard segment, aggro decks can really get, if they really have an explosive start, you're going to have very little room to survive. Ren and 6 can help by doing -1 to smaller creatures. Your lightning bolts can help as well. Ice Fang Coatl can also help, coming in and just kind of chumping, stopping a really big attack for a turn, hoping you stabilize next turn. So that's all possible in the main. In the side, you bring in Anger of the Gods, potentially Reality Shift, or whatever pieces you choose to put into your sideboard, and that's the strategy you have to use against aggro. You just really have to slow them down because they definitely can be faster than you. So yeah, that's my aggro. I don't think they're the worst matchup. They're definitely not a matchup I also want to see. Just because you're almost always going to stumble turn 1, game 1, unless they also stumble, which is possible. In which case, or if they don't, just one or even one key lightning bolt might be enough to buy you a turn or two. And then once you're in a soft lock or in a hard lock in terms of extra turns, it's game over. Big mana, similar. If they're going to get Tron turn 3 and then Karn-U or Ugin-U, that's going to be a big problem. But you could bring in a lot of hate from the side, or you can slow them down. But again, nothing in the main is really going to help you slow them down. What you could do is ramp yourself up, ideally with Explore and Arbor Elf, and hopefully you get into a lock by turn 3 or turn 4, and they they stumble, and that's that. So it's really going to be a race in game 1. Game 2 and game 3, you're going to bring in hate to slow them down even further. So I don't know. Again, you have no permission suite here in the main or on the side, so you have no way of countering their spells as they're cast. So either you choose to play permission in the side, you choose to swap out permission in the main and take out the upgrades that I've done to the deck since the last iteration. Or you decide to just play hate cards and hope it's enough. I think it would be. Again, just make sure you keep proper hands, don't take risky hands, and you'll shore up your win percentage. Not magic decks, dredge decks. We'll see what happens in the new meta now with new degenerate decks coming in. Obviously, if you're going to be playing against suspend decks, those are decks going to be really hard to play against. It's going to be a race with them. If you could race them, great, and get into a soft lock, great. But right now, they're pretty consistently going off on turn 3 or turn 4, which is going to make things really difficult for you. If they become prevalent in the meta, you may want to play the transformative sideboard, where you're bringing in Force of Negation, potentially other permission, to stop those decks from working, or at least slowing them down, so you have enough time to lock on your end. Control decks are probably the worst matchup you can have, especially game 1. Game 2 and game 3, you could ideally rely on Veil of Summer to kind of protect yourself a bit. but they are going to be difficult. They are going to waste a lot of their time and their energy countering your planeswalkers, countering your time warps. So you're definitely going to slow down. They're also going to be slowed down in their own ways. But a turn 2 Stoneforge Mystic that you haven't been able to answer, that you have no answers to, may end the game pretty quickly. So race them. Make sure you bring in some hate from the side or some protection from the side so that you can last long enough and you could anticipate their counters and stop those counters. And you should be fine. Bring in artifact hate to stop whatever artifacts they're going to cheat in if you're playing a Stoneblade deck. If you're not playing a Stoneblade deck, you're just playing a more traditional control deck, I think your odds are a bit better, just in my opinion. But if you are playing a Stoneblade deck, then you're going to have a really big uphill battle. Just my 2 cents, my experience with the deck, my experience with the matchup. Mid-range decks. This is really a tough a coin flip. I don't think it's as bad. I don't think it's definitely not as bad as control matchups or Stoneblade matchups. You have a lot more play here, but they also have a lot more removal. Removal you're less concerned about overall, apart from permanent removal, like Abrupt Decay or Assassin's Trophy. Jund and a lot of those type of mid-range decks, they tend to not like Assassin's Trophy. They prefer Abrupt Decay, which will attack your Renin 6, but it will miss your Tamiyo, which is actually a good thing. It'll also miss Fires of Invention, which is also a good thing. And those are cards that they don't necessarily plan for in the main. So you should be able to steal away in game 1 by just locking him into a soft lock, and they don't have many answers. Games 2 and game 3 they'll be ready for it, so they'll probably bring in some extra firepower on the side. But again, I think mid-range decks are relatively okay. They're not decks that go off turn 4 where if you have no answer it's GG, and that's okay. Because you can go to as low as 4 life or get out of bolt range essentially. Once you have them in a lock, it's a lock. They can't, there's no way out. You're just gonna get your extra turns over and over and over again, and they won't be able to win. So mid range is actually not the worst matchup. I would say it's definitely even better than aggro, at least in my experience and all the games that I've played with this deck. And that's it for Temur Turns V2. Version 2021, or at least I should say May, June 2021. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. What do you think about Temur Turns? Stay tuned for the 3 matches that are going up today. Yeah, let me know. This was a really fun deck. I really enjoyed coming back to it. It's one of the few decks where I can do something slightly degenerate, but in a fair way, in a way that you could totally interact with a lot more easily. I'm not playing, Ensnaring Bridges or Chalice of the Void, something to lock you out. You could destroy and counter everything that I'm doing here. But if you don't, you will be punished. And that's what I like about Temur Turns. It's fair, but if you don't deal with it, it's your fault. it's going to be GG. So yeah, stay tuned for that. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. Enjoy my content in general, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, follow me on Twitter, Facebook, share my content on social media, watch my content. All that stuff really helps me out a lot. Thank you. If you want to become a patron, get into those juicy patron rewards, check out the link in the Patreon. Check out the Patreon link in the description of this video. Yeah, like I said, the longer you're a patron, the more you get back at the end of every year. And yeah, at some point you'll probably be getting back more than you're putting in. It's not BS. My Patreon is not for me to make money. It honestly is there so I can have it fully sustain buying sealed product so I could open up on this channel. So I would appreciate your support. Thanks, and have a good one.